Go.
Hello everyone, welcome to Practical GCP. Today I would like to talk about quite a new Google service called Workflow, and the talk will be around to handle late arriving data using this service. And it's typically like giving you a different way to handle things like delayed data in a much easier way. So let me start by using a problem that exists in maybe many large companies in a large distributed environment. So if you look at this problem, right, so you've got this is where you have let's say you have a message queue that receive events to place an order for a customer, right? So when you try to place the order for a customer, you typically need to look up some customer information first, right? So that can be stored in the Google Cloud terms, maybe in Cloud Data Store as key value storage. But this storage is often populated from other services which are typically legacy systems that may not have real-time capabilities. And there might be files in there, there might be databases that have latencies in there, right? So the customers be registered, the data you are able to get from is not real time. So let's say this is the use case where we have 15 minutes latency, for example, and then we try to put the data as fast as we can into Cloud Data Store, where we can do the lookups to get the more information about customer so that we can place the order. But the problem here is that the customer may not be there yet, right? You don't know how long you're going to have to wait for the customer to be there. So when you do the lookup, there's a good chance the customer does not exist yet. And when this happens, you cannot place the order, right? Currently in a lot of these systems, what would typically happen is you may say, okay, I'm just gonna, keep trying, right, in Cloud Functions. But the problem with that is, how long are you going to wait? You don't know how long you're going to wait. Even you know how long you're going to wait, this will consume the compute resources of the Cloud Functions, which can be very expensive, right? That's one of the things. The other way is you can say, okay, I'm not going to acknowledge the message. I'm going to put the message back into PubSub. But this is a quite convoluted solution because it will just go around the circles, right? And then PubSub will do the retries, and it'll come back there, and it'll come back here again. It's quite a difficult thing to manage because there isn't any visibility of what is going on in there. So this is where Workflow comes to the rescue. But what exactly is Workflow? So let's have a quick look on the service itself. Just kind of the landing page from Google to give us quite a good explanation of what it does. So it's a fully managed orchestration platform that executes services in an order that you define. It's basically a workflow, right? But one of the key things, it can actually call customer services, right? All of the services pretty much on Google Cloud, including Cloud Run, Cloud Functions, and many other things, but also any other HTTP-based APIs, right? So it gives you lots of options to do many different things using Google services or just HTTP-based APIs. So one of the key things, if you look at kind of some of the use cases, it's been listed here. You get typically, right, if you look at this particular one, you may have a use case that in the cloud storage landing, some of the files that have been landed, it can trigger some kind of events and then gets processed using Cloud Functions, right? So in Workflow, you can orchestrate the whole piece of logic, such as if the file extension is TXT or versus JPEG, then it will use different kind of pipelines to process those. So it typically gives you a way to process things based on kind of triggering some kind of events and then doing a quite complex flow based on some logic. But the key thing there is it's really, really simple, right? So all it does is gives you some kind of you can either use YAML or JSON to describe the workflow. There's not much involved other than using a declarative language to describe your workflow's definitions, right? And then I will come back later on to have a look at a real example and what it looks like. But this is really key that it also listed a number of examples where you can use this for. But for all use case, if we come back to what we're trying to solve in here, is that we can use workflow to actually handle the late arriving data. And because it's a quite lightweight service that you can actually basically orchestrate many pieces of small components together, one of the key things you can do is wait and retry, right? So if you look at the different design, this is a very different approach using the workflow service. Still the same thing. In the event, try to place an order coming from pops up, right? And then, but what we do is we put a workflow in the middle and we check if the customer actually exists, right? So this first cloud function here is actually doing a lookup to check, do I have this customer yet, right? And if you don't have the customer, you can actually wait for a period of time, including exponential retries, right? And then you can try again later until you get to a point, oh, I found the customers, which could be 15 minutes later, right? And then you will trigger the second function to place an order using a order processing system somewhere else, right? Which could be a HTTP service. But you can also say there's a timeout, right? If you waited for too long and you really think that something's not right, right? It's the customer's never arrived, maybe half an hour or 1 hour or even much longer than that. Then you can say, okay, I'm just not going to wait for anymore, right? I will give up and then return an error. So this is a typical approach that you can use to handle late data. Because it doesn't have the overhead of try to run the Cloud Run service or the Cloud Function service just to wait forever and then consume the resources of the function. It basically kind of use this concept of steps, right, to kind of keep doing retries and then make these kind of decisions, right? Long story short, let's have a look at what the code looks like. So this is the repository of shared, like usual. It has I've documented this already. It has quite a few components in here. One of the key things is the workflow YAML, right? This is quite a simple example, but it actually solves a huge problem as we described in there. So you can assign a few variables. You can use this. It's called the system libraries that you can get the environment variable, which defines your current GCP project where you deploy it to. And in this particular case, what I'm trying to mimic the situation is to define a custom ID, which you can then replace with other services, right? So to pass in from other services. And then the next thing that happens in the step is if we check the custom exists, right? We typically do a try and retry block. So the try block basically make an HTTP post request to a Cloud Function service called customer check that we have deployed. You can see here, you can use dynamic variables in here as well. So right, you can put project in there that you don't have to put a lot of hard-coded implementation in your workflow file. And then you can define the headers of in JSON and the body with a custom ID, right? This is authentication type is the OpenID Connect, and that will automatically work with Cloud Functions in this case. You do have to give a number of permissions. I'll show you what you need to do in there in a second in the README. And then, but the key thing here is I've actually defined a retry block, right? This is the thing I was talking about earlier in the diagram, that I've defined a predicate that will only retry when the customer is not found. So what this predicate is defined outside of the steps of this main workflow as kind of like you can see as a function, right? Now what I'm trying to say is I'm passing the parameter and saying what to repeat, right? In this condition, if the code is 404, right? Because basically in the Cloud Run service I put in there, it will return a 404 when the customer is not found, right? So I couldn't find a customer, and then I'll return true. Then they will go into a retry. If I can find a customer, it will return false, and then it will carry on, right? So in this particular case, if the retry gets kicked off, there is a backoff being set. So initial delay is 2 seconds, then multiplies by 2 every time it tries it, and then with a maximum delay of 30 seconds as a cap. But it can only retry 10 times. So you can work this out on exactly how much retry you want to do, and then to work out based on your SLA of the service and when you're going to give up on this event. So the way this is designed is it will retry continuously for a period of time, and then only when the customer is found, then I'll do the important action for the customer, which in this case, in our diagram we've shown, is to place the order, right? So in here, I just basically log it to indicate this is actually, doing something else, right? In the following step, it basically, you can do much more advanced stuff than this, but I'm trying to show you the concept that this runs sequentially, and if you can't find this customer, you'll just keep doing this thing in the check if the customer exists step, and eventually you'll get to here or give up, right? So that's as simple as the workflow goes. The cloud function I've deployed in here is also very simple, right? But what I've done is I've actually plugged in Cloud Data Store to store the the customer, right? Some dummy customer data that where we can use to do the lookup. Later on when I do the demo, I'll show you what it looks like, because it's quite interesting and how the workflow works, right? In the when it does these retries, now we can trigger that kind of activity. But in here, you can check that the function itself is basically saying, I'm going to try to fetch the customer, and if the customer does not exist, I will abort and send the for back, right? But if it does exist, I'll basically send the status of the customer that is customer is found, right? So, and let's go back to the main README. So I just want to quickly talk you through the permission setup, right? So here you've got project ID, the service count I use for the workflow, and the service count I use for the cloud function. And once these are created, one of the key things you need to do is to create some binding. So I did allow it to write to the logs, but I also allow it to invoke the cloud functions. Right? This is very important, because if the workflow does not have permission to call the cloud functions, it won't be able to do it. Just keep in mind, I've done this at project level, but when you deploy it to production, your workflow should only have access to the cloud function that you defined for it to have access, but not everything in that project, right? Because we can have a lot of the cloud function deployed in the same project. And obviously this one, in order for the cloud function to work with data store, it will need to have the data store viewer permission in this particular case to do a lookup based on the key. And then these are the two blocks for deployment, one for the cloud function, one for the workflow, using the the service count we have defined. Okay, now let's have a look in action. So this is the interesting workflow, but not only you can deploy the workflow quite easily, but you can actually see the visualization that is as created. And this is really useful, because after you deploy this to the workflow service, you can actually see exactly how it breaks down. Earlier I actually did a more complex one. It actually gives me a lot of diagram, and one of the things, if you highlight, right, you can actually highlight, it will highlight the bit, you can make it bigger, and then you can actually look at exactly which part affects what, right? You can, depending on what you click on, it will highlight a different path for you. So this is obviously a simple one, it doesn't have that many lines. But when you do other things like wait, or if you have a callback, if you have different conditions or very complex if else, multiple switch statements, it will give you a much more detailed look on this thing, such as this one, right? So you can see this within the retry when not found predicate. It will have the two decision trees, with the decision tree with the left, which is if you couldn't find a customer, on the right is if you can, right? So this is so right now in my data store, I've actually got this customer, right? So I put the key in there, which is MD5 hash plus underscore and the original ID. In this case, it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. The cloud function has also been deployed, which will basically respond to the customer lookup event, right? If I just execute this and then trigger this thing, so you can see that. So you can also do, this is very similar to cloud functions. You can actually do it in the user interface to test things out. This is extremely useful, because otherwise it would not be very easy to get it right. You can see this is already succeeded, and because it actually found the customer. And in the logs, you can see some important action has been triggered, right, for the customer. So this is when it got to the this part. No, sorry, 1 second. When it got to this part of the pipeline, right? So it has not done the retry and then passed into that, right? Now let's delete this customer. So I'm gonna just keep this ID, so later I can come back to it, right? So now let me delete the customer. Cool. So there isn't a customer anymore, right? And then if you look at the trigger, if I execute it again, what's going to happen now is, right, if you actually go back to the list, so you can see I've done a lot of different kind of checks early on, but now you can see it's actually stuck, right? So it's actually stuck in the middle, and then in the check if customer exists loop. And if you go to the cloud function in here, right, and then look at the logs, so you can actually see it's been returning false or false, right? It's been doing the checks 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, right? That's what it's actually doing with exponential retries. If I just scroll down more, and it will do more retries. Now, what if I put the customer back? So the namespace I believe I used is the customer app. The kind is the customer, and then in the case of the name or the ID, I'll add a property called customer name, dummy, right? Right. Now I've got this customer here. If I create this again, let's give it a bit of a time. Right, you see here, it has found the customer and returned a 200. And then here, you see it's actually succeeded, right? So this is how the workflow can handle delayed data for you, which is extremely useful. And then I'll cover a little bit later on why this is so good as well when we actually sum this whole thing up. Right, let's go back to the presentation. So let's sum this up, right? So we have actually looked at the issues that we could have been facing, and then the solution with architecture diagrams, that how we're going to do it. But in this example, I've not actually covered how to hook this up to PubSub, because in reality you may have the use case described exactly like the diagram earlier on. You can actually trigger this with a PubSub using event talk. If you look at this one, right, this is the examples that how you can actually deploy the workflow and decoding the PubSub message. Then you see that customer ID I put in the pipeline later on, right? So this customer ID, if you look at the source code, so earlier I just hard coded the customer ID, right? But what you can do is to use the PubSub and decode the message, and then basically putting the message in the parameter instead, right? Instead of hard coding it, so that it will be able to connect to PubSub. So this is using the event talk to be able to trigger the workflow. It's still in beta. This feature, if you look at the very top, is actually in preview, but this is actually a very useful thing, because event talk for PubSub in this case, that to trigger workflow, it will be able to give you a way to trigger anything, right? So the event talk is a very we'll cover this in a different section, but event talk is typically many Google services that generate events. So those events can be used with event talk to then trigger different kind of services, right? So workflow is one of them, and then you can trigger cloud function, cloud run as well using event talk. So which is extremely powerful. But we're not going to cover it in this session. So, and then if you do this, then you'll be able to hook up the whole solution in with the PubSub topic using event talk to trigger the workflow, right? And then this whole solution would be complete. Okay, let's look at the second one. So the syntax references is a really helpful page to help you to find your way when learning workflow. I actually looked at a lot of these before, but if you look at things like the calling and the control flows, you can do calls, you can do jumps. So you can see the calls I did was you can call the system functions, right? You can call HTTP endpoint. Those are the calls. The conditions, the one I used quite a lot as well, which are these ones, right? You can see this depending on the condition in here, the steps, the switch. Can make different decisions based on that, right? So this is a very, very useful page that then I have bookmarked in here. And then the next one is the cheat sheet. So the cheat sheet, you can even download it as a PDF. So it basically contains the whole reference of every single thing you can use, right? And then it'll basically give you a lot of examples in here as well on how you can actually use each one of these functions, and extremely useful stuff. Again, highly recommend bookmark this so you can come back to it, because this thing is quite complex, so you do have to go back to the documentation quite a lot of times. Most importantly, this page is gold. It has so much code examples. I look at like, I think 80% of this already. You can it goes down into looking at how to assign variables, how to use some math functions to calculate catching errors, jump into a specific step, because the one I did earlier was basically sequential, right? But if you look at this one, you can actually jump into a specific step using the next statement, right? You can say whatever happened, and then based on the condition, you can jump into different section of this, which is extremely useful again, with very advanced features. But last not the least, this is why I said it's a really, really important service that is good as well, is because it's super cheap. If you look at the pricing model, right, ignore the free usage ones, but basically the way it works is based on the execution steps. So you have the internal step and external steps, but the key here is, you see that retry we did, right? So those are the steps, and if you do a lot of it, it's extremely cheap. Then you can actually see, total month of even this much, the cost is just basically 2 pennies, right, or 2 cents in this case. So this is compared to the other solution we were trying to do to send it back to PubSub and trigger the cloud function again and again. By waiting within those functions to consume those resources is very, very difficult to use. But this one, not only it gives you the visualization of the service like this, you can see exactly what's going in there with the decision trees. It helps you debug, it helps you track the whole thing. So, and that's why this service is really, really important. Okay, again, I've only showed you a very simple use case, but I think it's a quite effective use case, right? And then you don't have to try to do a lot of faffing around to handle late arriving data in a distributed environment, especially when you have a lot of legacy system that you don't have the luxury to have real-time data consumption, right? So this gives you a really good way to pull all of your data together with reliable API calls to make sure if something has happened, and then it's going to call the next step, otherwise it will just wait. Okay, that's the end of the session. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.
Go, go, go out!